Rhian is a Welsh writer. She's contributed to the recent analysis of Wales and neoliberalism, a kind of critique of the Welsh government in recent decades. She's written a fine sort of performative analysis of the Becker riots of the 19th century called Petticoat Heroes, and writes a lot on contemporary popular culture, and co-edits the magazine Red Pepper, the magazine of the sort of cultural left. She joins us today to talk about Raymond Williams and the breakup of Britain. So let me share my screen. Can everyone see Rhian on their screens? Yep. Thanks, Phoebe. Okay, I'm going to play it now. Let me know in the chat if it's not working. If not, we'll have to upload it later, but I hope it works.
Okay, I'm sorry I can't join you in person, so to speak, but I'm very happy to be taking part in this symposium and to be giving this paper, which is on Raymond Williams on the breakup of Britain. In The Country and the City, published in 1973, Raymond Williams explored the links between the process of nation building in Britain and Britain's empire building overseas. He also looked at the expression of this project through contemporary literature, specifically the tradition of country house writing, as a demonstration of his overarching argument that a relationship exists between what is happening in a society and the content of the culture that society produces. He then goes on to draw on this metaphor of the country house to suggest that throughout the period of imperialism, the Western world had itself become something like an enormous country estate, the centre drawing resources and labour from its hinterland, while the producers of this labour went unrecognised and unrepresented, literally written out of both the politics and the culture of the period. What's important about the links that Williams draws between nation building and empire building is the implication that the breakup of empire may relate to an accompanying breakup of the nation state itself. Indeed, in the years that surrounded The Country and the City's publication, the end of the British Empire was revealing material tensions within the imperial core, within Britain itself, which could no longer be smoothed over by the civic cohesion and economic prosperity that imperialism had enabled. Hence the instability and struggles of the 60s and 70s, which, alongside revolutionary nationalist uprisings overseas, included within Britain an upsurge in Welsh and Scottish nationalism and struggle for a united Ireland, as well as industrial and working class militancy. All of this variously in opposition to the unitary and centralised British state. These themes on the interplay of capitalism and imperialism in Williams's work and how they relate to the construction of an idea of the British state have been touched on previously in several studies of Williams. But for my purposes, I think these themes have gained a particular impetus now from three recent developments. Firstly, from Brexit and its after effects. Secondly, from the growing support we've seen in the past few years for independence from a centralised state, not only in Scotland, but also in Wales, and latterly in the English regions too. And thirdly, from the rise of a new localism and radical municipalist politics, which is community and place-based. So in this paper, I'm going to be briefly speculating on what Williams's perspective might have been on these new developments, and looking particularly at how he touches on these themes in some of his novels, as well as his criticism. So I'm going to start with a novel that might be thought of as somewhat incongruous within Williams's body of work, both in style and genre, although not in his themes. I think the content thematically is very familiar. This novel is The Volunteers, which was published in 1978. It's a dystopian murder mystery set in a near future UK of the 1990s. Among the futuristic aspects that Williams depicts is a Wales struggling for self-rule. It's been granted a Senate under a devolution agreement, but it's still reliant on finances allocated centrally, presumably from Westminster. And the novel makes it clear that this hasn't solved the material problems of class relations and inequality. In fact, the Volunteers opens with the attempted assassination of a government minister in the grounds of St. Fagan's Folk Museum. I think this is a brilliant opening scene for several reasons besides the slightly surreal drama of it. I think it works well on one level as satire, and it also questions the lines or the divisions between history and the heritage industry, just for two things. But to stick to my theme, it's significant that St. Fagan's was radical in its day because it focused on the history of ordinary Welsh people and preserving that history. And its early head, Iorwerth C. Peat, said that its task was not to create a museum which preserved the dead past under glass, but one which uses the past to link up with the present. Williams's future dystopia, however, imagines the museum as a place to which previously living and functioning farmsteads and cottages have been removed, the buildings uprooted from their original organic setting and reassembled in the museum grounds, where they stand as effectively a dead past under glass. In this version of Wales, the preserved aesthetic of the past is prioritised over the living politics of the present, which, as the novel opens, is represented by the industrial action being taken by workers at a nearby coal depot and its violent suppression by the authorities. This separation of the historical from the contemporary nation and the construction of national myths which take no account of living history has some obvious resonance when we think about the past few years in Britain as a whole. Brexit has shown us the political power that can be held by a myth of national sovereignty as something to be recaptured, and the endurance of that myth as a sunk cost fallacy in the face of the enduring problems that it has failed to solve. Importantly, The Volunteers is also an anti-imperialist novel. Its protagonist ends the story with a train of thought that lets him connect the authoritarian violence he's witnessed in a devolved Wales with the memory of his father's death in Kenya in the service of the British state and in the context of anti-colonial uprising and retaliatory violence. In The Country and the City, published 5 years before The Volunteers, William stressed the connection between a mystified capitalist order and an equally mystified concept of national identity and national interest. From the perspective of today, we can argue that Brexit has conclusively clarified the two by separating them. The economic after effects of Brexit, from capital flight to the disruption of supply chains, have demonstrated that the interests of capitalism rely on connections and dynamics which supersede the nation state, and over which political representatives of the nation state have little or no control. We see these same dynamics depicted throughout Williams's fiction, particularly in his Welsh trilogy, in which small communities are continually acted upon by historical and geopolitical forces beyond their control. His 1960 novel, Border Country, described the end of local industry in Wales in memorably bleak terms. His characters narrate the pitiless sweep of international capitalism through their community and the depopulation to come through migration for employment. One character states towards the end of the novel, "This place is finished as it was. This will be just a trunk road, you watch, between the mining valleys and the factories in the Midlands. So look carefully at it. You're seeing the last of it." These effects, however, are not simply internal between Wales and England, but international. One of Border Country's secondary characters is Morgan Rosser, a petty capitalist, but nonetheless a vaguely sympathetic figure, who starts up a small-scale food business in the hopes of providing local employment and selling quality produce. Williams demonstrates the vanity of these hopes by the end of the novel, when we see the small business taken over by a multinational conglomerate and its role in the chain of production reduced to merely labelling the pulp from abroad. The idea of national sovereignty, which would allow the UK to return to splendid isolation, was always a fantasy, but Brexit has brought this reality home. And this would have been no surprise to Williams, who said in a 1984 interview, "The average nation state simply cannot be independent. And if it pretends to be, it has to carry this off through a falsification, which seeks to cover up the fact that it is subordinated to the larger thing and driven by wider forces than those which can be internally controlled." The obvious dissatisfaction of the Brexit settlement has generated a search for new national, regional, or local identities. And we can see this giving rise both to reactionary xenophobia, but also to more positive movements towards federal and local initiatives. In 1968, in the New Left's May Day manifesto, Williams argued that any progress towards building a new Britain must acknowledge the degree to which the country and its people are enmeshed in international capitalism and imperialism. But he was also concerned, of course, with regional and local identity, and with the sense of place and community that he kept returning to throughout his work. He suggests that in order to assert a sense of regional identity, writers must first write with the awareness that other places and cultures exist, as well as with an awareness of internal variation and division. This process can involve not ever dividing fragmentation of communities, but making connections and finding common ground between them. Williams noted, for instance, that the oppression of the Thatcher years had been suffered by the working class in England just as much as those living in Wales, despite their geographical or cultural distance. In 1984, he talked about the prospect of alliances between the new urban left and what were then called the old depressed industrial regions. I think these latter areas are probably now what we might know as the Red Wall. Williams says that such an alliance is possible, although, he goes on to say, these areas may agree on the causes of their suffering, but you can't make much of an alliance out of negatives. The only real basis of alliances is agreement on positive proposals for transcending the negatives. He also says that if alliances are to happen, they will come from the people rejecting leadership and building a popular base. I think territorially based popular mobilization may be a way forward here. So here, as he does elsewhere, Williams is prioritizing place above nation as a means of galvanizing broad popular movements. This aspect is perhaps most fundamental to how Williams may have thought about contemporary Britain, his focus on the role of place and a sense of locality, which can both transcend internal divisions and facilitate the kind of regional autonomy that could provide a counterbalance to the political and economic dominance of London and Southeast England. Again, in his 1984 interview, Williams talks about having grown up close to a formative industrial experience, but also in a place that allowed him to observe rural Wales. He remembers there was a new Wales of the industrial valleys and the old Wales of emptying rural areas. The relations between them have always been fraught, and this uneasiness is reproduced in Welsh political thinking. There was the problem of how to relate the new, boisterous South Wales to the old rural Wales. But when you get the particular experience of continuing depression affecting both, there is the possibility of transcending the old divisions. When capital has moved on, the importance of place is more clearly revealed. He goes on to say a new theory of socialism must now centrally involve place. Ideally, a new movement comes out of new ideas being specified in particular places. Then there may be a model being expressed, which is adaptable to the interests of other places and scales of operation. So Williams perhaps anticipates here the desire for regional autonomy within England, depending on place and historical alignments, that we're now seeing in things like calls for northern independence or in contemporary debates within the left on how to integrate class and regional identity, and the turn towards localism and small-scale municipal socialism that's been growing as a result of the past few years' recognition that communities across the UK have essentially been abandoned by national government. The current government itself, of course, appears to have recognised this sense of abandonment and is paying lip service to it through the rhetoric of levelling up. But below this state level, there's been a more genuine recent tendency within local politics towards a revival of municipal socialism and what is known as community wealth building. This has been most notably expressed in Preston, in the north of England, in the Preston model of local government, but it's also expressed in moves towards alternative models of finance, regional banks, community energy schemes, mutuals, and cooperative models of worker ownership, which are becoming prominent in many areas of the country, including Wales. Many of these initiatives are underpinned by environmental concerns, focusing on providing green jobs or renewable energy in a way that also seems compatible with Williams's previous thinking. As the 70s and 80s progressed, Williams channeled his disappointment and frustration over the failure by Labour in government to enact socialism in the UK into the possibility of enacting it in Wales, and the opportunity that such a process offered to bring together the country's left strands of socialism, environmentalism, and social democracy. As early as The Country and the City, Williams was proposing a new relationship between city and countryside, which could synthesize these impulses of socialism and ecology. In his later work, he was developing a view of Wales which saw the country's potential for a form of socialism which would transfer power to working people through decentralization, small-scale autonomy, and sustainable development. At this point in his thinking, famously, he no longer looked to England as a reference point, but described himself as a Welsh European. But even when he almost eulogizes the potential of Wales for eco-socialism, Williams saw Welsh collectivist politics and Welshness itself as the product of a specific shared history and place, rather than any essential ethnic or cultural quality. He also draws a distinction between reactionary and progressive nationalisms, saying there is that nationalism which reinforces the idea of the traditional nation state. The other kind of nationalism is that which questions the whole basis of the unitary British state. I think that the first kind of nationalism is reactionary and the second is progressive. I'm going to finish by looking at the final book of Williams's Welsh trilogy, which is The Fight for Manod, published in 1979. Although in some ways this book is also a dystopian espionage novel along the lines of The Volunteers. Part of the backdrop to this novel is the search for possible economic alternatives for post-industrial Wales. The place of the novel's title, Manod, is envisaged as a new type of city to be built on the depopulated hill farms of South Wales. This city will integrate traditional agriculture with technologically advanced urban centres and be a community conceived from the very beginning in post-industrial terms. So this is quite a utopian vision, but it's interesting to see as far back as 1979, Williams was considering the fate of post-industrial areas of the country and considering how their remaining natural resources could be used in ways that are sustainable and of benefit to a whole community, rather than the extractive and exploitative relations that characterized the industrial era for these areas. As we've seen over our own lifetimes, the political and economic neglect of post-industrial areas after the 1980s is something that's only recently even been recognized, let alone addressed, at the level of the nation state. But in The Fight for Manod, Williams also recognizes that there are vested interests and political imperatives to be confronted if Wales is to have a chance at a successful and sustainable future. At the end of the novel, the fate of the place and its people is left undecided, with several conflicting options in play. The operative word we are left with becomes not the various utopian visions of Manod, but the fight for them, with that word's emphasis on human agency and on making one's own history, if not under the conditions of one's choosing.
So thank you, Rhian. That was an interesting experiment. From the comments I've received, it seems to have worked, that people heard the paper. Rhian was going to be followed, as I said, by my colleague Kirsti Bohata, who was going to talk in particular about Williams and ecology and environmentalism, which is a thread that becomes explicit in his writings from the late 70s into the 80s, with some fairly influential articles on socialism and ecology, but is of course a concern of his, at least an implicit concern, going right back to, well, border country that Phoebe discussed, and I think Kirsti was going to look at border country in light of some contemporary ideas on the environment.
Working the Land, Raymond Williams and Environmentalism. The climate crisis asks big questions of us as a society and as cultural and literary critics. As Margaret Atwood says, climate change could be rephrased, everything change. My interest, which is in its very early stages, is in the role of agriculture in climate change and biodiversity loss, and simultaneously in what changes in agricultural practices and economies may mean for rural places and rural cultures. In Wales, a perfect storm is brewing around land use in the context of a major decline in family farms, the rise of agribusiness, increased pollution from intensified dairy and poultry farming, the reduction and redeployment of farm subsidies since Brexit, and new pressures from the rewilding agenda and the even more recent boom in carbon offsetting backed by global finance. And these pressures are manifest in the anxiety and antagonism of current debates around land use although I should also say that there is evidence of creativity and innovation and bridge building. And of course, these pressures and debates and standoffs are not unique to Wales, although they have particular inflections and cultural specificities in the Welsh context. So this paper is an initial attempt to identify some of what Raymond Williams has to contribute to contemporary debates about agriculture, rural communities, and changing land use in the small bilingual nation from which he came in the context of the climate emergency and biodiversity catastrophe. There's a lot that could be said about Williams's relevance to contemporary environmentalism more broadly, from his emphasis on the colonialist dimensions of extractive exploitation and conquest of nature, to his argument for a green socialism within which ecology and economics can become, as they should be, a single science and source of values, leading to a new politics of equitable livelihood, as he put it in Beyond Country and City, a 1984 essay. All of these speak to well-being, to climate justice, and others have written about his relevance to eco-criticism. I'm not going into all of that here. Instead, I want to briefly look at what he says that helpfully frames the current situation in relation to agriculture, and what he says that might contribute towards solutions, for instance, a different understanding of efficiency. And also his emphasis on negotiation. What do we need to take into account when trying to shift away from deleterious agricultural practices? Williams explores the financial and economic relationships which shape the countryside, from the commodification of the countryside by rentiers to the shaping of high input agriculture by finance. And in this focus on negotiation and on work and change in rural places, as well as their material and social relationship to the city, or rather to capitalism, I think we can find a useful way of approaching some of the more febrile debates that we are facing right now. In particular, I want to suggest that Williams's interest in work, in manual and in other types of labour, offers a way of approaching land use which honours the cultural and emotional connections with the land, while foregrounding rural change, the possibility of change, but also past change, change in the present, and therefore the potential for change in the future. He draws attention to how working the land has always been in a state of flux, in a state of change. Some of Williams's assumptions are, of course, dated and have not necessarily unfolded in the way he expected. His optimism about the common agricultural policy, which is now widely accepted as fueling some of the worst environmental degradation associated with farmland, therefore seems misplaced. Although, interestingly, Williams sees it as, the reason he's optimistic, he sees the common agricultural policy as promising the maintenance of a viable rural economy and society. And it is these twin concerns of economy and society that underpins his most useful work. Oops. Though environmentalists see their efforts to increase biodiversity and carbon capture as a matter of life or death, the debate over land use in Wales is also framed in terms of a crisis and a matter of survival, specifically of community and culture and of the Welsh language as well. Though Williams was not particularly articulate about the Welsh language in the essays most focused on agricultural change or environmentalism, perhaps because he is focused on long anglicised areas such as the Black Mountains when he's writing about rural change, or sometimes he's focused on Britain more widely. But Williams did understand the way in which communities could be erased, metaphorically and literally, from plans which prioritise the commodification of the countryside. Oh, I've lost a slide. There we go. where the countryside is pictured as something to be consumed, as scenery, landscape, image, fresh air, as he puts in his essay, Ideas from Nature. And in an essay on Welsh culture, Williams recalls meeting a young bureaucrat who was describing rural mid Wales as a wilderness area for the outdoor relief of English cities. He never understood why I was so unsocially angry. Here was he looking on a map at rural Wales, at fields and hills soaked with labour, at the living places of farming families, and not even seeing them, seeing only a site for his wilderness. He had a friend, an economist, who used to prove to me once a week that the sheep by nature is an uneconomic animal, and that all this marginal farming with returns on capital that would cause instant suicide in the Barbican must simply be written off. And the people with the sheep, I ventured to ask. Of course, in that capacity, he replied without hesitation. This approach to rural land, where it is appropriated as a commodity to be used as a space of, as a leisure space, or now for other natural resources, has been described as eco-colonialism. And the fear of culture and linguistic erasure that eco-colonialism has sparked has given rise to enormous resistance to rewilding agendas and other environmental agendas. As you can see in that slide. And this one. And there's also, so this resistance to rewilding has led to an entrenched rejection of ecological science and conservative small c resistance to change, though in reality, of course, agriculture and agricultural communities have constantly been changing. So Williams's identification of the CAP as attending to agricultural society as well as business is important. But what if communities of Welsh-speaking rural dwellers who have worked for generations on the land are practicing an unsustainable and damaging form of agriculture? Williams is concerned to counter the erroneous belief that there had been no significant and destructive intervention in the natural environment before industrialism. So in one of his essays on socialism and ecology, he refutes the idea that we can go back to a conveniently sustainable form of farming. And he also counters the idea that it was only industrialization that created devastating change in the natural environment. He emphasizes the very long time scale of human transformation of the environment, including, quote, certain methods of farming, overgrazing, and destruction of forests, which goes back to Neolithic times. So this means there's no golden age to which we can return, a position shared actually by rewilding methodology, which contests the idea of conservation, that is, keeping an environment in a particular condition, even ironically an ecologically degraded one, or one based on a recent norm, a sort of an arbitrary point in time, often according to George Monbiot, actually the point in time that coincides with the childhood of a particular conservationist. But so the conservation is not the point, is not going to provide a solution to environmental problems. The argument of rewilders is that you cannot return to a previous phase of environmental integrity. Rather, you must identify a way of creating a new but self-perpetuating diversity. There is, as William says in his essay, no simple case for reversion. So Williams's ideas are actually rather interesting when we look at them in parallel with rewilding debates. He acknowledges change. He acknowledges, however, also he acknowledges change in in agricultural practice. He notes destruction going back into the distant past. But interestingly, he is also very much aware of the lived experience and the cultural and social presence of humans in on the land. So how do we negotiate a change which enables the community and the language to thrive while the patterns of work and life evolve to meet the new and frankly desperately urgent challenges of the climate crisis? How do we, in short, ensure climate justice here and play our part in addressing the global emergency? This is all about negotiation for Raymond Williams. In Socialism and Ecology, he foregrounds the importance of negotiation. You cannot just say to people who have committed their lives and their communities to certain kinds of production that this has all got to be changed. You can't just say, come out of the harmful industries, come out of the dangerous industries, let us do something better. Everything will have to be done by negotiation, by equitable negotiation, and it will have to be taken steadily along the way. In this essay, he's actually, and in that instance, he's actually talking about mining, and so he points to the divisions between the unions, who obviously are there to support working class jobs, and environmentalists who appear to be trying to eliminate working class jobs. But the statement is equally pertinent to farming today, though we should also add the linguistic cultural fractures in play in Wales too. The environmental argument about farming and the arguments about cultural sustainability in rural spaces are not just about cultural change. Of course, there are intense economic and financial pressures on farmers, and Raymond Williams has several things to say about this. He questions the orthodoxy that, for example, that increasing production will increase prosperity or well-being. This is a general point that he makes, but in an agricultural context has particular relevance. Williams is rightly troubled also by high input models of farming, and identifies financial structures that drive this emphasis on increasing production and high input intensive methods of farming. He says, underlying all these problems of intensive production, there is an increasing actual pressure of a financial rather than an economic kind. The huge involvement of agriculture in high interest debt and credit is usually a truer cause of the most frantic attempts to increase production at any environmental cost than the causes more often assigned of merely cruel or greedy exploitation. So he is drawing attention to the way that the money market economy generates a pressure to produce, and it's a self-defeating one. But he also therefore links change to, well, a need to create realistic prices for food, to pay realistic prices for food. And also he raises the prospect of dietary changes. Williams is also arguing, importantly, for a redefinition of the notion of efficiency, in which efficiency is a production of a stable economy, an equitable society, and a fertile world. These are arguments that are now familiar to us from the well-being agenda and the emphasis on climate justice, perhaps. If there's no way back and staying where we are is not sustainable, in what ways can change be negotiated in a way that is environmentally sustainable and fair? I think there are two key points from Williams that we can draw upon, and these are the ideas of use instead of consumption, the idea that we need to limit our consumption and focus on the use value of things, but also the emphasis that Williams puts on meaningful work. Williams takes the not unproblematic example of William Morris. I mean, Williams admits that it's a problematic example, to illustrate the difference between user and consumer. And he argues for locally based, non-exploitative, and also renewable and non-obsolescent kinds of work, where human production is governed by general human standards. I mean, these are quite big ideas, and I don't have time to unpack them now, but I'm introducing them for because I want to think about work and labour and the way that work may help us to negotiate different models for agricultural practice and rural culture. So through the meanings of work and meanings of work and labour change over time, and Williams explores this in Keywords and elsewhere. But labour remains a central theme in both his theory and his fiction. So in The Country and the City, Raymond Williams foregrounds the drudgery and the grueling toil of the rural poor and also the industrial wage workers. And yet there are also strains in Williams's view of rural manual labour, which is validating and perhaps somewhat nostalgic. I'm still unpicking what I think of Williams's relationship with labour and rural labour. But there's a moment where he recalls his father's rented patch, his 2 gardens, which appears in The Country and the City. Not in his fiction, where he gives this as an example of a relationship with a patch of land which is important not only for its produce, but, quote, if I get the right slide up, I haven't got it there, my apologies. He says that the rented patch is important for its direct and immediate satisfactions and for the felt reality of an area of control of one's own immediate labour, an area of control of one's own immediate labour. Is this nostalgic? Perhaps. But this recognition of control and the human affective relationship with labour and land is important. And also important is the role of historical labour in shaping the environment. So it reminds me of that reference we've already seen to Williams as describing the field soaked with labour, this sense of the affective, cultural and changing nature of labour in the landscape. So I want to move on now to talk a bit more about work in border country. Williams's focus on work, I think, offers us a way to bring into a focus for us the tensions in rural change, but also some opportunities. And importantly, what I want to suggest is that reading Williams's fiction alongside his theoretical work is the best way of finding these sort of jostling, subtle, layered issues that we need to engage with. Which we need to engage with along with the insights of science and technology if we're going to make any meaningful changes to land use. So we need to understand human relationships with work and the landscape. So I'm going to illustrate this point by looking at a couple of paragraphs from Raymond Williams's novel, 1960 novel, Border Country. And in these paragraphs, work evolves and the landscape changes, and we see traces of former practice which still remain in the landscape, legible in the land to the informed eye. So I'm going to read through the 2 paragraphs and then I'll come back and offer a sort of an informal reading of them. He had felt empty and tired, but the familiar shape of the valley had held and replaced him. It was one thing to carry its image in his mind, as he did everywhere, never a day passing but he closed his eyes and saw it again, his only landscape. But it was different to stand and look at the reality. It was not less beautiful. Every detail of the land came up with its old excitement, but it was not still as the image has been. It was no longer a landscape or a view, but a valley that people were using. He realized as he watched what had happened in going away. The valley as landscape had been taken, but its work forgotten. The visitor sees beauty, the inhabitant a place where he works and has friends. Far away, closing his eyes, he had been seeing this valley, but as a visitor sees it, as the guidebook sees it, this valley in which he had lived more than half his life. He stopped at a gate and looked down. Lorries were moving along a narrow road to the north. A goods train was stopped at a signal down the line, just beyond the tump, a round barrow tufted with larches that he had not known was a barrow when he went away. The line gang were working about 100 yards from the train, and there was grey smoke from their hut. Around them stretched the fields, bright green under pasture, or red with the autumn ploughing. You saw the wood, the tree line of the river, the intricate contours of slope and fall, and these slowly distinguished themselves as farms. Parry's Tregaron, James's Cumhondi, Probert's Tynawydd, Richards's Alldyrynis, Lewis's The Bridge. Then the other houses away from the farms, grouped in their patches along the lines of roads and lanes. Here in Hendra, people were busy around their houses, and the marks of their work were everywhere. In the untidy sheds, the stark posts of the washing lines, the piles of red earth beside the unfinished ditch, the sprawl of netting wire and old troughs in the fowl runs, the dirty lorry parked in a field corner with the black tarpaulins beside it on the grass. In the general loveliness that was so clear across the valley, he found himself narrowing his eyes to blur out this disfiguring debris around the houses. Yet as he did so, some quality vanished. It was now neither the image nor the actual valley. He turned and looked up at the mountains. On a low skyline, a tractor was moving in an area that he remembered as wooded, but that now had been cleared and fenced. Farther north, below the high barn, several dogs were running in a steeply sloping field. Since the rabbits had gone, hares were coming down from the mountain, and the dogs were chasing them now and in great circles, the whole hunt in this one field. Lower down, a field was being ploughed by a tractor, and the strip at the edge of it was spread with lime, the quick white standing out sharply against the turned earth. He looked down again into the weathered wood of the gate. This was not anybody's valley to make into a landscape. Work had changed and was changing it, though the main shape held. So I would want to go back through these paragraphs, and I have already put some text in bold, and I'll pay a little bit of attention to that material. But I think the word replaced is fascinating. When Raymond Williams reads this in a film, actually, he really does emphasize the word replaced. It puts him back, Matthew is put back into this place, but to a degree he is superseded too. He's been replaced already. What's really interesting about this landscape is that it's not still. Change is always, therefore, a possibility. This is place as process, not a still picture or a landscape or a view. And I mean, the whole idea of landscape as process is discussed really interestingly by Doreen Massey and others new in human geography, but I don't have time to go there now. But the place as process is crucial here, and people are using this landscape. Again, we've had that word use before, which is an alternative to consume, which he flags in socialism and ecology. So people using the landscape matters. And this is a place of inhabitants, places where somebody works, where friends live. Work, friendship, economy and community. This is what a lived landscape looks like. The lorries in the second paragraph, which are moving along the narrow road, symbolise the wider economy and the valley's relationship to it. Similarly, though, I think differently in terms of what the railway signifies, you have the goods train. It's a goods train here, not a passenger train. So this is about production, moving products around the country. The lorries, I think, end up being more dehumanizing. There is still a sort of a working class and community around a collective working class identity around the railway. We don't get that sense with the lorries. The lorries tend to speed through the valley, separating houses from the community and sort of endangering pedestrians. There's something, we don't get a sense of the lorries as being part of a working class community. The tump, which is a barrow, although Matthew had not known it was a barrow when he went away, is a really interesting detail. So we have the sense of the layering of history, but we also have a sense that not all knowledge is contained within the valley, and that there are different types of knowledge, as well as, you know, here we have an appreciation of different temporalities, it's the Neolithic, but just as importantly, what we're registering is that Matthew had to go away in order to find out what the tump meant, what it signified. And also in that tump we have a sense of geological time, or a gesture towards the geological time, which is actually more important elsewhere in the novel. The line gang, again, another example of work. I keep hearing chain gang with its echoes of carceral coercion and worker exploitation, but actually here we've got a sense of the maintenance of this artery, this network of rail that links different types of industrial labour together. And we have an instance of industrial labour within this rural space. The fields here are bright green under pasture or red with autumn ploughing. These are workspaces. These are not, this is not nature. This is worked agricultural land. But pasture is a word that Williams dwells upon in his appendix to The Country and the City. He's interested in the word as it's associated with sustenance, which gives rise to the pastoral in religious terms. And today, so this pasture is sustaining, but today we might regard the bright green of pasture with suspicion, the result of repeated glyphosating, ploughing and seeding with ryegrass, which is the favoured type of grass for feeding livestock, which looks pleasant, it's very green, but in reality it's an environmentally degraded monoculture. And we're reminded throughout this passage that the visitor sees beauty, that still landscape devoid of life and work, and we're taught to be suspicious of this guidebook version. So I think it's difficult from a contemporary perspective to read that bright green field without an element of suspicion. Farms eventually are slowly distinguished. You need some insider knowledge to be able to recognize the farms, and the way in which Raymond Williams maps human lives onto the contours of slope and fall is through these farms and the naming of the farms. The farm names also register another change in this landscape. The names are mostly in Welsh with a few English, and they represent the linguistic history of the place or the people. Once Welsh speaking, it's now increasingly anglicised, but there's still a residual presence for Cymraeg. Because the family names are associated with the place names, there is that real sense of these as family farms, inhabited spaces. Again, these hills are soaked with the labour, and the place names and the people's names remind us of that human relationship. We're told that the marks of their work were everywhere. The work is untidy, it marks the land, it sprawls. It's also superseded. Those old troughs and the dirty lorry have been there for a long time, and some of them are redundant. But I think the most important thing about the marks of the work that Matthew observes is that the work is unfinished. It's a process again. On a low skyline, a tractor was moving. in an area he remembered as wooded, but that had now been cleared and fenced. And we might wonder who's enclosing this land, about what's lost in the process of this enclosure, and the destruction of woodland is a process that Williams often actually invokes as a shorthand for the long environmental damage imposed by man on the land. It's significant also that what Matthew sees as a moving tractor in this cleared land. Tractors themselves, of course, take part in transforming agriculture in the period after the Second World War. There's a tendency to see agriculture as rooted in tradition, yet this is one of the industries that has undergone huge upheavals and transformations during the 20th century. Actually, there are a surprising number of tractors in this short passage. I don't think it's accidental. The tractor symbolises 20th century agricultural change. Lower down, a field was being ploughed by a tractor, and we have a strip at the edge which is spread with lime, the white standing out sharply against the turned earth. So tractors are transforming the landscape. These contrasts, the different appearances, the change in use, in boundary and fluctuations of nature. The trees have gone, but hares are returning. So, and there is a sense that while we might have cleared the trees, other parts of nature have returned. Of course, the rabbits have gone because of the introduction of myxomatosis, which is a disease which was a mild disease in South America, but it was introduced into Europe and Australia to decimate the rabbit population in the 1950s. So there's been another human intervention which has caused an unbalancing or arguably a rebalancing of nature. And we're told that there's a whole hunt in one field, which is an extraordinary image. I think it signifies a great deal, and I'm still unpacking this. It seems to be asking to be read symbolically, allegorically, and perhaps also provides the invitation to read the whole passage in this somewhat elevated way. The hunt doesn't mention people, so we don't know if the dogs are loose on their own, or if the people has simply erased in this description, which would be a curious act, given the other concerns that I've been talking about, the importance of human interaction with the landscape. But hare coursing also evokes a sense of history, a lineage or a link back to the princely pursuits that might once have taken place on these hills. Another reason why Williams may have unpeopled this hunt, to make space for the traces or ghosts of other eras. And later on in the novel, there is an important scene where Matthew is looking out across the marches and recalling the medieval and earlier Welsh past. It's also really interesting that there's something about the activity taking place in this bounded area that I think is important. But as I said, I will have to return to that question. And then right at the end of the paragraphs, he looked down again into the weathered wood of the gate. The history, the liminality of the gate, this suggestive invitation to pass through it into a new way of seeing. The final statement, this was not anybody's valley to make into a landscape. Work had changed it and was changing it, though the main shape held. And I think that's the line for me that provides all those possibilities. Work had changed and was changing it. The main shape held, and yet there is still the possibility for other ways of doing things. I hope this gives an indication of the suggestiveness of Williams's fiction and its connections with his critical and theoretical work. I'm not the first person by any means to suggest that fiction and the theory need to be read together and that they inform each other. It's a well-established point. And it's a point that Williams makes himself in the 1979 film, The Country in the City by Mike Dibb. The point of this reading then is not so much to suggest that Williams's theoretical engagement with the country and the city, with green socialism and so forth, helps to illuminate the richness of his realist fiction, though it does. Rather, I'm trying to adopt Williams's fiction as an extension of his theoretical work to suggest a working model for an interdisciplinary engagement with land use in the face of climate collapse and extinction. What Williams brings together in this passage reminds us that we need to engage with the forces of global capitalism, the ecological realities of land use for flora and fauna, and most of all, that we need to recognize human relationships with the land over time. And work, or perhaps labor, is a process which connects the land to the economy, society, and culture. In his fiction, Williams foregrounds work as human and constantly evolving. One question perhaps which will have to be asked and answered through negotiation, and I think through a focus on the materialism and cultures of rural work, is whether we can or even want to make the main shape hold, while, to paraphrase Margaret Atwood again, changing everything. Of course, Williams's work doesn't provide us with a comprehensive template. His analysis is largely silent on gender, although actually, interestingly, some of his arguments overlapped with those advanced by Anthropocene feminism or ecofeminism. I haven't gone into this here, but I think there are suggestive overlaps. On the other hand, his general theories often seem to be silent on ideas, on minoritized cultures and languages. Nevertheless, Williams's work is a remarkably rich starting point too, as he puts it in Ideas of Nature, to begin to make the full connections and relationships we need to make in order to reimagine and reorganize social and economic relations, to enable us, again, in Williams's words, to live well and sensibly on the earth.
I met Harald at a conference, a wonderful conference at Potsdam that he'd co-arranged called Beyond Crisis, reassessing Raymond Williams in 2018. And one of the keynote speakers at that conference was Gustav Claus, a leading historian and cultural critic of working class literature. Gustav was a very good friend to many of us in Wales. He'd, in his work on British working class literature, he'd paid attention to South Walian writers such as Idris Davis and Lewis Jones. And I was very sorry to understand that he died relatively recently. In fact, I was contacting him to tell him about this event when this became apparent to me. So I'd like to publicly, well, remember Gustav, and an international conference dedicated to Raymond Williams is a very good place for doing that. I remember Gustav Claus's paper very well because he was talking about being in Britain in the 1960s and actually contributed and responded to the questionnaire that went out from Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and E.P. Thompson as they were preparing their May Day manifesto. So yes, to remember Gustav. I'm delighted that Harald was able to join us today. He's a lecturer at the University of Potsdam and has written on Oscar Wilde and the political. Is working on a book at the moment exploring the concept of affect in relation to world literature. And Harald is going to speak to us today on the theme, if I can call it up, Feelings Without Structure, a cultural materialist view of populism and affective politics. So Harald, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind of introduction, Daniel, and for having me in this fascinating symposium. Thanks also to the other speakers. It was most inspiring. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope that this works well. Can you all see the presentation?
Yeah, that's fine.
That's the way it should be, yeah. It's going to be a sound file later on. I hope this is going to play properly. Otherwise, I would just send you a link where you can access it. So thanks once again. My talk titled Feelings Without Structure will be about the evaluative or normative dimension of William's key phrase, which is of course structure of feeling. I'm going to argue for a new reading of William's concept that might help to differentiate between what you might call good and bad feelings. This might still sound a bit fuzzy at this stage, so I better get going. My point of departure is a scholarly debate about the usefulness of structure of feeling in cultural analysis. Typically, the phrase is grasped as the absorption of ideology or a configuration of different and changing ideologies into the everyday. It can play a special role in capturing the deeper dimension of cultural change, acting as what David Simpson called a barometer, a supersensitive indicator of movement at the ideological level. Such a use of the term would be, in a purely descriptive way, a name given to any outcome of social and historical analysis. However, the way Williams himself used the concept was not always in this purely descriptive way. Scholars like David Simpson have criticized Williams for sometimes using feeling in an evaluative sense, as in good English feeling, allegedly encapsulated in worthwhile English novels. Perhaps you might say this aspect should not be overemphasized, and it might be related to the birth pangs of the critical concept. Yeah, we've heard it earlier today about Williams finding the concept unsatisfactory, yeah, even in Politics and Letters. I would argue that we should not simply downplay or ignore this evaluative aspect. So I do agree, to begin with, that there is a way of understanding feeling in terms of an undefined yet positively connoted residue from the past. However, I don't think that this should necessarily be seen as a problem. To think of structure of feeling as having an evaluative dimension or normative core might be really useful for critical academic work. More specifically, I think not only the expression feeling, but the whole phrase structure of feeling has a normative potential, and actualizing this normative reading might benefit present-day social and political analysis. To make my idea clear, I'm going to specify on that normative dimension of feeling and the phrase as a whole. To begin with, if good feeling is not just unquestioned nostalgia, one might think of possible criteria that could distinguish good from bad feeling. We should not forget that when Williams reconceptualized structure of feeling in terms of the culturally pre-emergent in Marxism and literature, he tended to understand structure of feeling as both motor and symptom of deep cultural change. That is to say, regarding the concept's normative dimension, that good feeling would hence be not any social experience in solution, but more specifically, a dynamic social experience directed at a desirable outcome. That leaves us with the question, how can we summarize Williams' desired outcome of processes of social transformation in most general terms? To find an answer to that question, one would have to look at his works, and I'm only going to take one example, namely one from Modern Tragedy, a work that takes its cue from the classical Aristotelian definition of tragedy in terms of a feeling-induced societal learning process. So it is in this work that Williams thinks about the role of feeling in social transformation. And I think Modern Tragedy should gain wider critical attention in this regard, not being just a work about drama or about literature. The criterion of which change is desirable or real for Williams in Modern Tragedy seems to be that the structured feelings should be part of a development towards a more inclusive, society in which more people can participate as what he calls whole human beings. The continued attempts in a long revolution to overcome the radical disorder in which the humanity of some men and of course women is denied, and by that fact the idea of humanity itself is denied. So this is basically where William wants to go. To interpret William's words here, such a view would entail the realization of greater social equality, democratization, and cosmopolitanism that exceeds and renegotiates the boundaries of any institutionalized social logic. That is to say that the normative core of the structure of feeling then is an idea of justice which aims at the improvement of material conditions, as well as what Williams referred to as a culture of active mutual responsibility and cooperation. So this is his desired outcome of social transformation processes. And this would also be the normative core or structure of feeling, according to my suggested reading. However, we should not only think about the content of the phrase, as already indicated, what feeling is, but also look at its form, which I suggest reflects the normative content in a poetically condensed way. Articulated as a tension between structure and feeling, the scintillating term serves as a warning not to dismiss that challenging and precarious connection between the two. Good feeling and structure in terms of social conventions and institutions, also of rational deliberative discourse more generally, should be brought together. Thus, the phrase itself provides an added layer of its normative dimension. More specifically, feeling in affective experience and everyday activity should not be politically facilitated to lose the ties to its socially structured dimensions, while structures, social conventions, and institutions must pass the ongoing test of lived and felt reality. Now I have said that a normative reading can be useful for academic work, and you might ask precisely in what way. A possible field would be affective politics, or the study of populism, when feelings are aroused in politics and whose evaluation is often a complex and complicated task. In more general terms, my normative reading might help in evaluating political feelings precisely by asking how they are related to structures, social conventions, and institutions, and what this might tell you about the quality of these feelings in the first place. Now, I'm quite aware that this might still all sound a bit abstract at this stage, so I would suggest looking at two examples to make clear the kind of analysis I have in mind. The first example would be German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision in 2015, just going back in time a little bit, to temporarily open Germany's borders for refugees, which was criticized by many as irrational, detrimental, and populist. My second example is closely related to the first one and looks at the German far-right populist movement Pegida's response to this migrant crisis. Looking at Angela Merkel first, her decision is often associated with a famous statement she made during a press conference in 2015, namely, "Wir schaffen das, we can do it," which reportedly encouraged a number of helpers to come and assist the arriving migrants, which also entailed a considerable change in Germany's political climate as a whole. Now you may ask what kind of ideological structures there might be behind Merkel's arousal of feelings in what was widely registered as a very emotional statement. She might have just opted for the most pragmatic way of tackling the crisis, considering that no alternative solution was readily available and that a human disaster would have meant bad publicity. Also, she might have been thinking of Germany's economy, especially its unsatisfied demand for low-wage laborers. These two motivations, of course, would have been clearly in tune with dominant or hegemonic culture. However, focusing on the particularity of what many understood as a powerful slogan, "Wir schaffen das," would indicate that she was quite aware that she could also draw on the support from the left for her policy. The slogan reiterated Barack Obama's "Yes, we can," which, when used during his former presidential campaign, signaled a profound societal change to be expected from the first Black US president. Also, the slogan would entail a heavy nod towards feminism, echoing the iconic feminist poster featuring Rosie the Plumber, and thus implicitly would seem to empower women as participating citizens. In Williams' terms, a case can be made that the success of Merkel's statement is due to her sensitivity for emergent strands, eager to transform Germany into a more hospitable, cosmopolitan, diverse, and inclusive society. The "we" in this sense could therefore be understood as foreshadowing a new participatory culture, redefining national politics as acting in concert rather than mere crisis management. Merkel's statement can hence be interpreted as a cogent communicative act expressing a level of awareness that her ambiguous words will be decoded in the right way by the right people. Looking at my second example now, this forms in many ways the opposite of Merkel's statement. The Pegida movement, and Pegida is of course an acronym for Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamicization of the Occident. This movement became more and more visible in 2015 when reacting to the migrant crisis with a call for keeping German and European borders closed. As a recurring cultural form, Pegida organized so-called Montagsdemos, Monday demonstrations, echoing the weekly rallies that had played a crucial role in bringing about the end of the East German authoritarian regime, leading up to German unification in 1990. At one point, an official hymn was created, which was played during the demonstrations and circulated on the web. This Pegida hymn, in its first instantiation, did not feature any lyrics, but only consisted of rapped and ah sounds. And I don't know if you can hear it. I'm going to play this. Not sure if it works. Can you hear it? Yes, and I can imagine that you can imagine the rest, and it builds dramatically up until it reaches some sort of climax, and it goes on without any articulate lyrics. The precise way or structure of how, in William's terms, Pegida tapped into the residual of an exclusive nationalism while drawing on cultural forms that one would historically associate with emergent democratic forces. It is the old posing as the new. The precise way or structure of how these strands are brought together is very much obscured by feeling, as epitomized by the Pegida hymn. Feelings are thus aroused as part of what Walter Benjamin called aestheticization of politics, which is not meant as what we today would understand as an aesthetic or unalienated and authentic sense of the political. Rather, Benjamin's aestheticization of politics is about aesthetic experience posing as the political by being actually aimed at repressing it from coming into rational discourse. Aestheticized feelings in this sense are thus ultimately put in the service of non-communication. In conclusion, remembering my initial question about the normative dimension of structure of feeling, I have given two examples of a good and a bad structure of feeling respectively. On the one hand, Merkel's "we can do it" implies a structure of feeling in the good or normative sense. Feeling is aroused as part of a process of communication that facilitates a transformative process. The we is at stake here. What kind of state or structure do we want to be? Do we want to live in? Do we want to be a part of? With a heavy nod towards left-wing and emergent strands. On the other hand, the feelings aroused by Pegida are opposed to structure. Any reasonable idea or discourse about how society should develop. Instead, such feelings tend to undermine any kind of deliberative process. Feelings such as those evoked by the hymn are thus inherently uncommunicative and can thus be said to be feelings without structure. Yeah, and with this opposition, I would close my talk. That's all for me. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to discussing a few of these things with you.